If you're seeing this, hold your focus for the next few minutes, because something in your field has already shifted. You didn't stumble here by accident. There's a reason this moment found you, and it's not about motivation or inspiration. It's about a quiet threshold you've been approaching without realizing it. What if I told you that today, specifically today, your attention is not just a habit but a lever, and that how you hold it in the next hours determines whether you remain in the same reality loop or step into an entirely different timeline? You've felt it, haven't you? That faint pressure beneath your thoughts, that subtle tightening in your chest. Not fear exactly, but the sense that something is watching your next move. Not watching in a threatening way, but in the way a horizon waits for the Sunday. And if you're honest, you know you've been circling the same patterns, the same self-doubt, the same interruptions in your clarity, as though life keeps resetting the level right before you advance. That is not coincidence. That is the Quantum Zeno effect happening inside your lived experience. Not the textbook version with particles and measurements, but the human version where what you repeatedly observe in yourself becomes the cage you keep rebuilding. Today is different because you're becoming aware of the observer behind the habit, and awareness is the first crack in the loop. If you're seeing this, it means you're already in the narrow corridor where your choices echo louder than usual. Think of this like standing at the edge of a long hallway, with doors slightly open on both sides. Every thought, every breath, every micro-focus determines which door swings wider. Normally, your mind wanders without consequence. Today, wandering has weight. Today, the field pays attention. And I don't mean that in some mystical warning. I mean that your nervous system, your breath rhythm, your emotional tone, everything is more impressionable right now, like wet paint on the inside of your being. If you touch it unconsciously, it smears. If you touch it consciously, it becomes art. What if I told you that the interruptions you've been facing recently were not obstacles, but stress tests designed to reveal how easily your attention is pulled out of alignment, not as punishment, but as preparation? Because a moment is approaching soon when you'll be asked to hold your focus in a way you never have before. And when that moment arrives, you don't get extra time. You don't get a countdown. You get a split second, a single inhale, the tiniest window where your state determines your outcome. That is the final test in the title of your own life. And it's not a cosmic exam or divine evaluation. It's the instant where you decide whether you collapse back into your old identity or stabilize the new one you've been sensing inside you. Quantum Zeno is a mirror, and today that mirror turns toward you. So if you're seeing this, pause. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough to notice the space between one breath and the next. Notice how your awareness gathers itself in that gap. Notice that something in you is listening differently right now, as if a deeper layer has just surfaced to the doorway. That's the part of you this message is talking to, the one preparing to hold focus with the steadiness of a mountain and the softness of a whispered truth. Stay here. Stay aware. Because what unfolds next requires the observer in you, not the thinker, not the reactor, but the quiet, steady presence that remembers who you are before the noise begins. You already know what it feels like to live in a loop, even if you've never called it that. You wake up, check the same notifications, feel the same background tension, replay the same unresolved conversations, and keep promising yourself that next week you'll really change. Yet somehow next week looks strangely like last week wearing a different outfit. On the surface, your days are filled with variety, different tasks, different people, different news feeds, but underneath, there's a familiar script running, a pattern of reacting that makes new opportunities feel suspicious and old disappointments feel inevitable. This is the perceptual crisis you're in. Your outer life keeps shifting, but your inner observer keeps freezing the same frame. Quantum Zeno in human terms. You keep looking at yourself in the same way, so reality keeps obligingly repeating. Let's slow this down and look at the mechanism, because once you see how the loop works, you can stop calling it fate. It usually begins with a trigger. Maybe it's a message you weren't expecting, a tone of voice that feels sharp, a bank notification that tightens your chest, a silence from someone you care about, a glance in the mirror that activates an old story about your worth. The trigger itself is often small, almost trivial, but your body doesn't respond to the logic of the situation. It responds to the memory encoded in the pattern. Without your permission, your breath subtly changes. It might become quicker, shallower, or disappear into a held, invisible tension. That shift in breath is not just stress. It's the first moment where the loop reboots. From there, your state begins to tilt. Breath changes chemistry. Chemistry changes feeling. Feeling changes perception. Again, we're using quantum as a metaphor, not as a medical claim. Think of your body as a field of tiny observers, each cell waiting to be told whether the world is safe or dangerous, supportive or hostile. The way you breathe after a trigger is like a broadcast message to the entire system. We're under threat, or we're okay. Most people never notice this crossroads. They register only the afterglow: sudden irritation, quiet shame, a surge of anxiety, numbness, the urge to scroll, snack, or escape. Then meaning rushes in to explain the state. The mind hates gaps, so it starts filling the space with stories. They never really cared. I'm behind. It always goes wrong for me. This is just who I am. These interpretations feel like accurate descriptions of reality, but in truth, they're more like captions you keep pasting over the same image. The trigger shifts your breath, the breath shifts your state, and now the state demands a story that matches it. This is the place where your inner observer is supposed to step in, but if you've never trained that observer, your mind takes the stage alone and calls itself the truth. Once the story is in place, action follows. Not necessarily big, dramatic action. Often it's the quiet decisions that carry the most weight. You leave a message unanswered. You don't apply for the opportunity. You speak a little harsher than you meant to. You avoid the conversation that could bring clarity. You open the same app and scroll, 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 until the feeling dulls. On the outside, these are tiny moves, barely noticeable in a single day. But in the field of your life, they are measurements. Each action confirms the story your state demanded. And then comes evidence. Reality, being the generous mirror that it is, reflects back the consequences of those actions. The unanswered message leads to distance that seems to prove people leave you. The avoided opportunity becomes proof that life doesn't offer you much. The harsh tone sparks a conflict that proves relationships are fragile. The scrolling eats the time you could have used to build something real, proving that you're undisciplined. You look at this evidence and say, "See, this is just how it is." But you're standing inside a hall of mirrors, forgetting you're the one holding the initial camera. This is the reality loop. Trigger breath divided by state, meaning action, evidence, reinforced identity, more of the same triggers. And because the loop often runs below conscious awareness, it feels like external reality has all the power. You tell yourself stories like, "I attract the same kind of people. My nervous system is just wired this way. Good things don't last for me." The more you repeat those phrases, the more your inner observer becomes a passive witness, a tired audience member watching the same play, night after night, believing the script can't change. The crisis isn't that you have these loops. Every human has loops. The crisis is that you've started to confuse the loop with who you are. You've begun to treat your pattern as your essence, your wound as your identity, your repeated story as your destiny. And when you do that, Quantum Zeno takes on a darker flavor. Constant, unconscious observation of your old self solidifies that version of you, like checking a seed every second so obsessively that it never gets the stillness it needs to sprout. But here's the subtle mercy built into all of this. The moment you can see the loop, you are no longer fully inside it. The very act of mapping trigger, breath, state, meaning, action, evidence that act, is the observer waking up. You might still feel the pull of the old pattern, but now there is a sliver of distance, a tiny gap between "this is happening" and "this is me." That gap is everything. It is the riverbank beside the rushing water, the sky behind the clouds, the still point where a new trajectory can begin. Today, the reason you're being asked to hold your focus is simple. The loop is about to present itself again, in a familiar disguise. The trigger will come, the breath will want to constrict, the story will cue up its usual lines, but this time, you will know there is another option. Before we step into that option, we need one more ingredient. A new understanding of what it means to observe yourself, not as a critic or a judge, but as a conscious participant in the field that surrounds you. That's where the quantum metaphor stops being abstract and starts feeling like a lived experience. To understand why holding your focus today matters so much, You need to feel, not just think about the way observation shapes your lived experience. Not the laboratory version of the observer effect, but the inner human version that operates every time you breathe, choose, react, or pause. When you hear the word quantum, don't picture equations or particle diagrams. Picture the moment before a decision, the fragile silence right before you speak, the way your body subtly rearranges itself when you feel seen. That's where the metaphor comes alive. Quantum is simply a mirror for your inner mechanics, a way to understand why attention has consequences. It's the language we use to name something you've sensed your whole life, that the way you look at something changes the way it shows up for you. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a field at dawn. The air doesn't move. The grass holds its breath. The light hasn't decided yet whether to reveal the world or keep it veiled. In that suspended moment, everything exists in potential. Which path you take, how the day will feel, even the tone of your inner voice, none of it is fixed. You are surrounded by possibilities like unopened envelopes. But the moment you choose one direction, your experience begins collapsing around that choice. You turn the potential into the actual. This is not physics. This is your life. The quantum field is a metaphor for this space of possibility, and the observer is the part of you with the power to select which reality becomes solid. This is why emotional patterns are so magnetic. When you habitually observe yourself through the lens of anxiety, disappointment, or self-doubt, those states become the gravitational center of your reality. You don't choose them consciously. They become your default measurement. And just like in quantum metaphor, measurement collapses possibilities. You stop noticing opportunities because your attention is busy confirming old beliefs. You overlook subtle invitations because you've trained your awareness to scan for danger instead of possibility. You replay conversations because your mind is trying to measure itself into safety. Without realizing it, you keep collapsing the same emotional timeline. Now take a breath literally, right now, and feel what happens when you soften your attention. Let it spread out a little, like light diffusing through morning fog. Notice how different that feels compared to the tight, narrow focus you carry when you're worried or rushing. This soft, open state is coherence. Again, not a scientific claim, just a metaphor for the way your inner world becomes aligned, harmonious, less fragmented. In coherence, your breath deepens naturally, your chest loosens, your mind stops grabbing for proof of old patterns, and the field of possibilities around you stops shrinking. You're no longer collapsing reality out of habit. You're allowing reality to unfold from a calmer, clearer center. Think of coherence as the oval of breath around you, a gentle boundary where your inner and outer worlds meet. When you breathe with presence, that boundary becomes stable. Reactions lose their urgency. Thoughts lose their sharpness. Emotions still move, they're supposed to move, but they stop dragging you with them. And in that stability, something remarkable happens. Your choices become creative rather than automatic. You're back in the space of potential instead of stuck inside the loop. This is where the Quantum Zeno metaphor becomes deeply human. The principle suggests that constant observation keeps something from changing. Apply that inwardly, and you'll recognize why your old identity feels so stubborn. You've been observing yourself the same way for years, watching your fears, tracking your failures, monitoring your flaws. Not because you're broken, but because survival taught you to scan for what might hurt you. That pattern of internal observation has frozen certain versions of you in place. You've been looking at yourself in a way that keeps the past alive. But today, the moment you soften the gaze literally or metaphorically, you interrupt the Zeno loop. You stop measuring the old self and begin witnessing the emerging one. It doesn't require force or affirmation. It requires presence, attention, a shift in the quality of your observing. And here's the subtle miracle. When the observer changes, the observed changes. When the part of you doing the watching becomes kinder, more spacious, more aware, your inner patterns begin unfreezing. New possibilities warm at the edges. The field around you reorganizes itself not because you forced it, but because you stopped constricting it. Think of your awareness as a lantern. When you shine it narrowly on a fear, the fear grows large and real. When you shine it on a possibility, the possibility steps forward. When you shine it on your breath, your system settles. When you shine it on your inner stillness, clarity rises like smoke from a quiet fire. The lantern doesn't judge, it simply reveals. and what it reveals becomes the path you walk. You've felt this before in sacred moments, right before you said yes to something important, right after someone forgave you, right when a stranger's kindness softened your entire day, or when a memory resurfaced with suddenly new meaning. In those moments, your observer shifted. Something in you widened, and reality rearranged around that widening. That's coherence. That's the emotional dimension of the quantum metaphor. So today, holding your focus isn't about discipline or effort. It's about remembering the power of your observing presence. The field around you responds not to your wishes, but to your state. When your state stabilizes, the final test you're approaching stops being a threat and becomes an initiation. But before we cross that threshold, there's an older language, a symbolic language that can help you feel this truth more deeply. That ancient metaphor is where we go next. To understand the threshold you're approaching, we have to step into a different kind of language, older than science, older than philosophy, older than the stories you've been telling yourself about who you are. Every civilization that explored consciousness used metaphors to describe the shift from reactivity to presence, from drifting to awareness. These metaphors weren't decorations, they were maps. They pointed to the moment when a human being steps out of their loop and into coherence. And among the oldest of these maps are the Egyptian teachings of Ma'at and the Buddhist practices of ānāpānasati, two traditions separated by geography but united in their understanding of the observer. Imagine the Egyptian Hall of Two Truths. You've likely seen the imagery at some point, the deceased, standing before a great scale, their heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. People think this scene is about punishment or judgment, but that's a modern misunderstanding. The weighing of the heart is a metaphor for inner alignment. The feather represents coherence, truth, balance, the inner stillness that comes when your breath, your mind, and your intention move together without contradiction. The heart represents your lived experience, the weight of your thoughts, the density of your patterns, the heaviness of the loop you keep repeating. The Egyptians weren't saying be perfect, they were saying something far more subtle. Your heart becomes light when you are no longer dragged by unconscious patterns. When you observe yourself with clarity rather than fear, the pattern dissolves, and the heart rises. In this ancient metaphor, you stand at the threshold, not a doorway in the afterlife, but the doorway inside yourself where stillness begins. That threshold is today. That threshold is every moment you choose not to repeat the same inner measurement. In Egyptian terms, every time you breathe consciously instead of reacting automatically, a feather lands in your heart. The heart gets lighter. The loop loosens. You become less bound to the past and more available to the present. Now contrast that with the Buddha seated beneath the Bodhi tree, practicing ānāpānasati, mindfulness of breathing. Not breath control, not forced calm, just awareness of the breath as it is. The Buddha understood something that modern nervous system science is only beginning to language. Observing your breath without interference brings your entire system into alignment. It's the same metaphor as Ma'at, lightness, balance, coherence, but expressed through the simplicity of noticing. Every inhale becomes a moment of awareness. Every exhale becomes a release of tension. And between them lies the same quantum gap we've been talking about, a still point where intention rests quietly before becoming action. The Egyptians approached coherence through symbols of cosmic order. The Buddhists approached it through direct experience of the body. But both traditions pointed to the same truth. Your state determines your reality, and your breath is the bridge. The sky and cloud metaphor the Buddhists used is the same riverbank metaphor we've been using here. The sky represents the observer, unchanging, spacious, untouched by passing weather. The clouds represent thoughts, emotions, sensations, stories all moving through. The Egyptians called the sky Horus. The Buddhists called it Sati. You call it awareness. The name doesn't matter. The experience does. Let's bring this ancient imagery into your present moment. Picture your awareness as the feather of Ma'at, light, balanced, uncomplicated. Picture your emotional patterns as the heart, sometimes heavy, sometimes restless, sometimes calm. When the heart reacts, it sinks. When the heart is witnessed, it rises. Your task today is not to make the heart perfect. It's to observe it with enough gentleness that the weight lifts on its own. Now add the Buddhist lens. Observe the breath without trying to fix it. Let the inhale be what it is. Let the exhale be what it is. In that simplicity, the heart and feather come into balance. You become the scale, the place where awareness and emotion meet without fighting. The ancients also understood thresholds. In Egypt, they built literal doorways inside temples to mark transitions from ordinary space to sacred space. Each doorway required a change in state, a breath, a pause, a softening of attention. In Buddhism, the threshold appears as the moment you notice a thought without being pulled by it, the moment before reaction, the moment of choice. This threshold is exactly where the final test in your life will appear, not as a dramatic event, but as a subtle moment where your inner balance is challenged. A familiar trigger will present itself, and your breath will want to tighten. Your mind will want to collapse into the old story. But the ancient metaphors remind you, the test is never external. The test is whether your awareness remains light enough to stay on the scale without tipping. This is why we use metaphors like sky and clouds, riverbank and water, doors and thresholds. They're reminders that you don't need perfect conditions to access coherence. You need presence. You need breath. You need the observer within you to wake up and hold the moment gently. When the Egyptians said the heart must be true, they didn't mean morally pure. They meant aligned, consistent, steady, echoing the natural rhythm of the cosmos. When the Buddhists spoke of liberation, they weren't talking about escaping life. They were talking about meeting each moment with enough awareness that the mind stops binding itself to old patterns. Right now, you are standing between two metaphors, the feather and the breath. Both invite you into the same stillness. Both point to the same truth. Your next reality depends on the quality of your observing. And from here, we shift from ancient metaphor into direct experience. Because knowing these symbols is one thing, feeling them in your body is another. And it's in the body where the real transformation begins. Now it's time to bring everything from metaphor into your body. Because transformation never happens in the mind alone. The mind can understand the loop, study the patterns, admire the metaphors, even agree completely with the logic, but unless your nervous system feels a new possibility, it continues performing the old script. The Egyptians built temples not as intellectual statements but as immersive experiences. The Buddhists taught ānāpānasati not as theory but as direct, moment-to-moment awareness. Your temple, your Bodhi tree, your hall of two truths, all of that lives inside your breath. So let's step into an experience, not a performance, not a technique to force calm, just a gentle exploration of awareness. A safety note before we begin. Nothing here is medical advice. Nothing should cause discomfort. And if at any moment you feel strain, dizziness, or unease, return to your natural breath. Think of this as educational awareness training, not breath manipulation. Start by noticing the place where your body is meeting the ground or the chair beneath you. This grounding is your riverbank, the place where the observer can sit. Feel the subtle weight of your body. You don't need perfect posture. You only need awareness. Let the breath be exactly as it is. Not deeper, not slower, not better, simply observed. The breath has been carrying you since the moment you entered this world. Now you are finally turning toward it with presence. That alone is powerful. The first phase is notice. Place your attention gently at the entrance of your nostrils. Feel the breath entering, cool and soft. Feel the breath leaving, warm and effortless. Let your awareness touch the breath with the lightness of the feather of Ma'at. If thoughts arise about what you need to do later, about whether you're doing this correctly, let them drift like clouds. You don't need to push them away. You only need to remain the sky. Each time your attention wanders, bring it back with the tenderness of guiding a child by the hand. That return is the practice. The second phase is coherence. Slowly shift awareness from the nostrils to the center of your chest, the heart chamber in the Egyptian inner temple. Don't try to breathe into the chest. Simply notice sensations. Maybe the area feels warm, or tight, or numb, or open. All sensations are welcome. Your job is not to perfect the chest, it's to witness it. Coherence begins when you allow the heart to show itself without judgment. As you notice the breath moving, imagine the inhale softly expanding the space around the heart, and the exhale gently releasing its weight. Again, no force, just awareness. This is the balancing act on the scale, the feather meeting the heart. The third phase is gap. After your next inhale, notice the tiny pause before your exhale begins. Don't hold or stretch it. Simply recognize it. That pause is the quantum doorway, the moment untouched by pattern, expectation, or identity. It is where your choices reset. Feel its stillness. Notice how your whole system seems to listen in that silence. On the exhale, notice the matching pause at the bottom. 2 thresholds, 2 invitations. This is where the old loop loses its grip. This is where intention forms quietly, like a seed inside dark soil. The 4th phase is encode. As your breath continues naturally, choose a subtle quality you want to bring into your day: clarity, steadiness, compassion, courage, spaciousness, patience. You don't need to chant it or visualize it intensely. Just let the quality rest lightly in your awareness as you breathe. On the inhale, imagine welcoming that quality. On the exhale, imagine sending it into the field around you. In Egyptian metaphor, this is placing the feather on your heart. In Buddhist metaphor, this is the sky clearing. In quantum metaphor, this is observation becoming creation. Now gently release the practice. Allow your breath to return entirely to habit. Notice how your body feels, maybe slightly heavier, or slightly emptier, or slightly more open, maybe no different. All responses are valid. The purpose was not to create a dramatic shift, but to awaken the observer. You are practicing the state you will need when the final test appears: a calm presence, a grounded awareness, a heart that doesn't collapse into old patterns at the first sign of challenge. From this foundation, you can begin using micro-protocols throughout your day. These are tiny practices, each only a few seconds long, designed to interrupt the unconscious loop before it completes its cycle. First, the 1 breath reset. Whenever you feel a trigger, an email, a tone of voice, a memory, you pause for a single breath. Inhale, notice the gap. Exhale. This interrupts the trigger breath state cascade. Second, the shoulder check. Once every hour, become aware of your shoulders. If they're lifted or tense, let them drop. This signals the nervous system that you're safe enough to choose rather than react. Third, the heart step. Before entering a room, sending a message, or starting a conversation, pause for half a second and place attention on your chest. You don't need to change anything, just notice. This activates coherence before engagement. These micro-protocols are not about control, but about remembering. They help you stay centered in situations where your old patterns would normally take over. They help you enter moments with the clarity of a mountain rather than the turbulence of a cloud. And they prepare your system for the turning point that is coming, the moment where you shift from being shaped by your reality to shaping it through presence. There comes a moment in every inner journey when the old identity tries to reclaim its territory, not because it's malicious, but because it's familiar. Patterns don't dissolve quietly. They test the edges before they release their grip. And you may have already felt this today: the slight pull back into the loop, the whisper of an old story, the tightening of the breath. This is the turning point, the precise place where your path forks. You can either reinforce the old version of yourself or step into the creator who has been slowly awakening beneath your reactions. The shift from victim to creator is not a motivational slogan. It's a change in where you place your awareness. Victim consciousness observes life from the turbulence of the water. Creator consciousness observes from the solidity of the riverbank. Victim consciousness asks, "Why is this happening to me?" Creator consciousness asks, "What state am I in as this unfolds?" The event hasn't changed, the observer has. And when the observer changes, everything else reorganizes. To make this real, not theoretical, you need to see how this applies in the everyday domains that keep looping: money, relationships, and leadership. These aren't abstract areas. They're the mirrors where your patterns express themselves most vividly. And each scene reveals a different doorway out of the loop if you're willing to hold the observer state long enough. Scene 1. Money. Imagine you open your banking app or look at an invoice that hasn't been paid yet. The numbers don't trigger logic first, they trigger breath. Maybe your inhale shortens, maybe your chest contracts, maybe you feel a subtle drop in your stomach. That micro shift is the beginning of the loop. Before the mind even forms a thought, the body has already declared, "I'm not safe." And the thoughts that follow, "I'll never get ahead, this always happens," are simply the story that matches the state. In victim mode, you take action from contraction. You panic, you avoid, you shrink your plans. Money becomes a field of scarcity because your state keeps collapsing it into scarcity. But as creator, you interrupt the moment at the level of breath. You pause. You feel your feet. You observe the contraction without fusing to it. You soften the chest by 2%. You choose one coherent inhale. That alone breaks the physiological script. Now the thoughts that arise can be different. What's actually needed here? What can I do next from stability rather than fear? Maybe you send the email you avoided. Maybe you ask for clarity. Maybe you reorganize something calmly. The numbers didn't change yet, but the field around them did. You shifted from reacting to creating. Scene 2. Relationships. Picture a message from someone you care about, a short reply, a delayed response, or a tone that feels off. Instantly, your body interprets it through old patterns. Abandonment, rejection, conflict, uncertainty. Again, breath changes first. Shoulders tighten. Jaw sets. Thoughts rush in to fill the gap. They must be upset. Maybe I said something wrong. Here we go again. In victim mode, you spiral. You over-explain, withdraw, accuse, or anxiously seek reassurance. All of these actions produce evidence that confirms the loop. But in creator mode, something else happens. You feel the trigger. You do not deny it. But you breathe once in awareness, noticing the sky behind the cloud. You ask yourself, what state am I speaking from? If the answer is fear, you wait. You don't fix. You don't chase. You choose coherence. And from that place, you send a message that reflects clarity instead of insecurity. Or you wait until you can respond without collapsing into the old emotional imprint. This is how relationships shift, not through perfect communication techniques, but through coherent presence. Scene 3. Leadership. Leadership isn't a job title. It's the way your field influences others. Maybe you're leading a team, or a family, or your own future. Imagine walking into a difficult meeting or conversation. If you enter from the old state, tight breath, cluttered mind, reactive energy, the entire room feels it. People become guarded or chaotic in response, not because you said anything wrong, but because your field is unstable. Victim mode tries to control others to fix inner instability. Creator mode stabilizes itself first. One breath, one gap, one awareness of the heart. You enter the room with coherence instead of tension. People feel it instantly. They soften. They think more clearly. They collaborate more freely. You didn't push. You aligned. That is leadership. The turning point is always the same. You stop waiting for external circumstances to grant you permission to feel safe, clear, or empowered. You create the state first, and the circumstance adjusts. This is the opposite of the loop. The loop says, when things change, I'll feel different. The creator says, when I feel different, things change. The loop says, life is happening to me. The creator says, life is responding to me. Embry. Today, the final test you're approaching will not come with a warning label. It may arrive as a small annoyance, a familiar fear, or a conversation that activates your oldest story. The test is not about perfection. It's about noticing the moment your breath begins to contract and choosing coherence instead of collapse. Choosing the riverbank, choosing the sky, choosing the observer. And from that stillness, choosing your next move with intention rather than habit. This turning point isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the moment the feather and the heart balance. It's the moment you stop being pulled by the loop and start shaping the field around you. And once you cross it, you'll begin feeling something deeper, something that touches dignity, meaning, and belonging. That's where we go next. There is a moment, subtle and unannounced, when all the techniques and metaphors you've learned stop being practices and start becoming a way of being. You don't notice it at first. It begins as a quiet spaciousness under your thoughts, a softening in the way you relate to yourself, a gentler quality in the questions you ask. Instead of, what's wrong with me? The question becomes, what's happening in me? Instead of, why is life doing this to me? It becomes, what is this moment asking me to see? This is the beginning of dignity, not the dignity bestowed by achievements, titles, or recognition, but the dignity that arises when you meet yourself without shrinking, when you recognize that you are not a collection of flaws to be corrected, but a field of awareness discovering itself in real time. This shift is not dramatic. It's not a cinematic breakthrough. It's more like the way dawn enters a room, slowly, without permission, by simply being what it is. You realize that belonging was never something you earned through performance. It was something you reclaim by returning to coherence. When you breathe consciously, even for a moment, you are reminding yourself that you belong in your own life. You belong in your body. You belong in the field that surrounds you. You belong in the story you are shaping, not because you are flawless, but because you are aware. Stillness becomes less of a practice and more of an atmosphere. You begin to sense that stillness isn't the absence of movement, it's the foundation beneath movement. It's the place inside you that doesn't chase validation, doesn't collapse under pressure, doesn't disappear when someone else disapproves. Stillness doesn't make you detached from the world. It allows you to walk into the world with a quiet authority, an authority rooted not in dominance but in presence. You become less concerned with being right and more interested in being real. You stop performing clarity and start embodying it. In this stillness, something remarkable happens. Your life becomes public art, not in the sense of spectacle or display, but in the sense that your presence begins shaping the environment around you. Your steadiness becomes a kind of architecture, an invisible design that gives others permission to breathe more deeply, to slow down, to choose differently. When you enter a room centered, the room reorganizes. When you speak from clarity rather than urgency, conversations shift tone. When you listen fully, people feel seen. You become a living sculpture of coherence, influencing others simply by being anchored in yourself. And there is no grandiosity in this. In fact, the more coherent you become, the less you need to think about influence at all. You're not trying to lead anyone. You're not trying to prove anything. You are simply inhabiting yourself with such honesty that others feel their own honesty reflected back to them. Stillness becomes contagious. Presence becomes generative. You become a reference point in a world addicted to velocity. This doesn't mean the world stops testing you. Life continues to offer friction, not as punishment but as sculpting. The final test you face again and again is always the same. Will you collapse into the old story, or will you stay with the breath long enough to enter a new one? Some days you'll hold the observer with grace. Other days you'll fall straight back into the loop. But even that is part of the belonging. You're not meant to transcend being human. You're meant to participate in it consciously. The deepest philosophical truth in all of this is simple. You are not here to escape the world, nor to dominate it. You are here to relate to it, to meet each moment as an unfolding conversation between your awareness and reality's possibilities. You are here to discover that meaning doesn't come from outcomes, but from the quality of attention you bring to the unfolding. To realize that you are never actually disconnected from the field, you only forget to feel the connection. And when you remember, even for one breath, you reconnect not only with yourself but with everything that breathes alongside you. You begin to sense that you are part of a shared fabric of becoming humans, stumbling and rising, collapsing into old loops and awakening into new truths, all learning in their own timing how to return to the riverbank, how to become the sky, how to place the feather on the heart without fear that it will tip the scale. This is where dignity lives, in the gentle truth that you are allowed to be both in progress and in possession of wisdom. You are allowed to be both flawed and luminous. You are allowed to belong, even in your becoming. So as we approach the closing ritual, hold this in your awareness. You do not need perfection to pass the final test. You only need presence. You only need one coherent breath. You only need to remember that the observer in you has always been the one shaping your path. Before you leave this space, I want to guide you through a simple ritual, not for symbolism, not for performance, but to help you anchor the observer you've been awakening throughout this journey. Think of this as your final alignment before you step back into the world and encounter whatever form today's test takes. There's nothing mystical you need to achieve and nothing you can do incorrectly. This is simply coherence made intentional, presence made tangible. First, take one gentle inhale through the nose. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough to feel the air touch the inside of your body. Notice the exact moment the inhale stops. That pause, that tiny sacred gap, is where your old story loosens. Now let the exhale fall out naturally. Feel the ground supporting you. Feel the space around you settle. Now take a second breath, slightly slower. Inhale, noticing how your awareness gathers itself. as though returning from corners you didn't even know it wandered into. In the pause at the top, feel the quiet intelligence that lives beneath your thoughts. Exhale softly, letting your chest soften by 1 degree, just one. And now a third breath. Inhale with the intention of becoming the observer once again. In the gap at the top, imagine the feather of Ma'at resting inside your awareness light, balanced, unforced. Exhale into the field around you, letting your presence expand just a little, like a quiet ripple on still water. 3 breaths. That's all you ever need to realign. Now choose one word, just one that reflects the state you want to carry into the rest of today. Maybe it's clarity, or calm, or courage, or openness. Maybe it's trust, or focus, or presence. Whatever word arrives first is the right one. Don't analyze it, don't negotiate with it. Receive it the way you would receive a message from your future self, simply, directly, without argument. Hold that word gently in your awareness now, and whisper internally or aloud, I choose to, your word, as the observer, not as the reactor, not as the old identity, not as someone trying to control life, but as the observer, the one who shapes the field through presence, the one who meets each moment from the riverbank rather than the current. Feel how different that declaration is from a typical affirmation. It's not a demand, it's not a wish. It's a stance, a position of consciousness, a way of inhabiting yourself. And the field responds to stance far more than it responds to effort. As you move forward today, you will likely encounter a familiar trigger, something small, something ordinary, something you've looped around before. When it comes, don't brace against it. Meet it the way you would meet a cloud drifting across your sky. Pause for 1 breath, feel the gap, remember your word, and step through the moment as the observer, not the echo of your past. If this experience resonated with you, if you felt something in your inner architecture shift, even slightly, then stay connected to this frequency. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in the sense that returning here helps you remember who you are beneath the noise. Subscribe to this frequency, where we explore consciousness not as an escape, but as a way of participating in reality, with clarity and coherence. Carry your word into the rest of today as though it were a key, because in truth, it is.